Hello, I've just finished The Body, A Guide for Occupants by Bill Bryson. This time I can't show you the book because I actually listened to it as an audiobook, but I did finish it. I'm not really sure how these videos are going to go when I'm discussing a book that, like a nonfiction book. I guess we'll see. Um, so the book itself is a popular introduction to the human body. Um, it's sort of surprising, actually, when I'm thinking about this book in the abstract, how little people are interested in the functioning of the human body, considering it's it's what you are. Um, and I don't even really exempt myself from this problem. Like, I am, as a biology teacher, of course, more like interested in the human body than most people, but I think that my interest is like not nearly at where it should be, considering that I live in a body. Um, anyway, I want to contextualize the reading with just sort of what was going on uh, as I read it. I read this, so I'm as I mentioned a biology teacher, and um, I try to read like one popular science book every semester or so that I can make the way that I instruct my students more like interesting. I guess the hope is that even though I already know a lot of what's in these books, that I will, well, one, I'll get to learn some new stuff. Um, and number two, I hope that by like reading books that are written for an audience that isn't forced to listen to this information. I'll learn how to make, biological information more interesting to like convey to my students. So anyway, that's why I read the book in the first place. I also picked it up because picked it up instead of any other like biology book because my sister, who almost never reads any books, like she just has not read since she graduated high school. um, she owned, I noticed when I visited her that she owned a copy of this book and even had it like bookmarked on the 10th page. So I was like, oh, wow, maybe this is, a really, really interesting book. Turns out it's only somewhat interesting. There's lots of fun facts in this book. And what I found, which I think is sort of a problem for writers like Bill Bryson, just across the board, is that there's so much to know about the human body, and a relatively small proportion of it is inherently interesting. That if you're aiming to only hit the like interesting points, you're going to struggle to provide the structure that people need to actually like understand what you're saying and synthesize it and like store it as a system of knowledge rather than just knowing that the the prostate gets cancer more often than other organs. Um, yeah, so I guess my overall assessment is that it's all right. Um, if you already know quite a bit of biology, it might be quite an interesting book for you. But I guess what I'm saying is that it hits this troubling middle ground where if you don't already know some biology, like if you actually are Bill Bryson's core audience of people who don't know very much about the body, then the information that he tells you is just not going to fit in your head. Like if you don't already know, uh, if you don't already know, like if you don't already know enough biology to explain how the digestive system and the respiratory system fit together, then you're probably not going to learn very much from this book. Like you'll just end up with like a big pile of fun facts, which hey, that can be cool. But um but yeah, I mean, I think it's really a fundamental limitation in this type of science communication in that Bill Bryson does not aim to make you educated on the subject per se. He just wants to tell you things about the subject, and those are very different. Those are two very different goals. Which is, yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to make of it. I guess my conclusion is that no matter how many fun science books I read, my classroom will never be like a scishow video. Like that will never happen because I actually have to give the structure to my students, and the structure is just not very fun. So yeah, my assessment, it's okay. I think this book is actually an absolutely excellent like side read if you're studying for a biology course. Like if you're beginning medical school, I think this would be an excellent book to read in your free time because it's true that these fun facts don't really like stick if you don't have the structure, but also if you have the structure, learning like fun things that connect to that structure will help you remember it better. Um, okay, so to give an example from something that he talks about in the book, there are several organ systems in the body that have, as a fundamental part of their like structure at the most basic level, the idea of maximizing surface area. The three that are pretty obvious once you think about them are the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the circulatory system. All three of those need to maximize surface area because they do something that can only happen at like a boundary in your body. The respiratory system allows air to pass from outside your body to inside your body. The digestive system allows nutrients to pass from inside your digestive tract to inside your circulatory system. And your circulatory system allows whatever it's carrying, whether oxygen, nutrients, hormones, whatever, to pass from the circulatory system to their destination. And so all three of those organ systems need to have different structures to maximize surface area. And they all do so in slightly different ways. So that's a fun fact. Like that's fun to think about. And it helps you to structure the way that you would think about um, sorry, it helps you to remember like how you would think about the way that these organ systems fit together. But the way that these organ systems fit together is not inherently fun. So I guess my overall review is that it's good if you either already know, but you already have a pretty good grasp of biology, or it's good if you are attempting to acquire that grasp of biology and you want something somewhat entertaining to supplement that knowledge. Um, Okay, that being said, I just want to talk about some of the interesting things that are in this book. So, first of all, okay, the smallest fact that's kind of fun, and this probably won't be fun for you, but for some reason I just can't get this out of my head. It's really interesting to me. Hormone. First of all, the hormonal system was discovered relatively recently in terms of organ systems. Your hormone system is the most recently discovered one, and will probably be the last organ system ever to be discovered, which is fun. Um, Second, the thing that I can't get out of my head that you will almost certainly find boring is that hormones do not share uh, a set of structural similarities in the same way that, say, nucleic acids or proteins do. And the reason is that a hormone is not a type of molecule. It's more like a job description for a molecule. So some of your hormones are proteins, some of your hormones are acids, some of your hormones are lipids, all sorts of things. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And this, by the way, explains why it is that some hormones, for example, melatonin, can be you can get the effects of melatonin by ingesting them. Like you can take melatonin pills and they will make you tired. But other hormones cannot be ingested. For example, insulin, you have to inject directly. And the reason for that is that there are some key structural differences between those two hormones that make it so that melatonin can pass through your stomach and through your digestive system and into your blood, whereas insulin would just be digested. Also, insulin um, deteriorates. It basically implodes after a relatively short period of time anyway. Um, so anyway, I find that utterly fascinating. Uh, the other things that came up, I would say The book brings up cancer quite a lot. And I think that through reading this, I got a more thorough understanding of what cancer really is. Um, it also helps that I'm going through like a biology course with a bunch of students, so I've had lots of practice explaining this, explaining things, and it has sort of clarified the type of thing that cancer is. Because we talk about cancer like it's one thing, like it's one set of diseases, like it's one disease, like it's like you have, tuberculosis over here, you have heart attacks over here, and then you've got cancer over here. But the thing is that cancer is more like a type of disease. It's more like a type of affliction. And the problem with that is that people talk about curing cancer, right? Curing cancer is like curing injury. There's so much variety in what cancer actually is that sure, we might cure certain specific types of cancer in the same way that, like, I don't know, taking a small puncture wound to the knee is no longer very likely to kill you because of modern medicine. Like, we might make it so that certain types of cancer don't really kill people very often anymore. But it's extremely unlikely that we're going to develop a panacea, that we're going to develop something that can be used to fight all cancers, because are cancer tumors are literally as varied as the cells within your body, and in fact more so because they mutate and change. Um, and the other thing is that I don't remember if this is in the book, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway because it's really interesting. To some extent, cancer, um, and senescence in general, by the way, like the fact that we age as well as cancer, are just the prices that are completely necessary to pay for being a multicellular organism. Um, as a unicellular organism, first of all, among unicellular organisms, there's no such thing as cancer because all unicellular organisms essentially behave the way that tumors do. They seek to replicate out of control as quickly as possible. Um, so you can't have cancer as a unicellular organism. But the reason that cancer is an especially problematic is problematic for multicellular organisms is that essentially the gambits of being multicellular at all is that two cells come together and they sort of have this deal with each other that, look, buddy, as long as we stick together, we're gonna spread our genetic information way faster and way better than any of those schmucks who are doing it on their own. And so these two cells sort of stick together. But there's always, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit, there's always a sort of temptation for one cell to back out of the deal and just start replicating all on its own. And in the long term, that is not a successful evolutionary strategy because a multicellular organism with cancer is probably going to die and is certainly not going to benefit in spreading its genes by way of having cancer. So cancer at the level of the organism represents a loss um, in evolutionary fitness. But at the level of those particular cells, uh, cancer represents a gain in evolutionary fitness. Because remember, what genes want to do in the paradigm of evolution is spread themselves. They don't actually care about this whole organism thing. They just want to spread as quickly as possible. So from the perspective of a cancerous cell, a cancer is a new adaptation that allows those genes to spread. And the fact that that strategy is not going to be successful in the long term doesn't really matter. I mean, there are plenty of evolutionary strategies that are not successful in the long term, but that doesn't make them any less a factor of evolution. And so what I'm trying to convey, which is like quite weird and like creepy to think about, is that part of being a multicellular organism is that evolution does not just act on you as an individual, it acts on all of your cells individually. And it's in terms of like proliferating themselves, it is in the interest of each of those cells to develop into a cancer and spread out of control within the extremely supportive environment of your body. So yeah, that is one of the pressures that multicellular organisms just have to deal with, including all human beings, which is that evolution acts on each of your cells individually and not just on you as a as an organism. Um, so that's why we have cancer. That's why multicellular organisms pretty much have to have cancer. Um, and the reason that cancer is so varied is that, first of all, cancers can uh, evolve quite quickly because they're replicating out of control, and so they can change the way that they work as cells. Essentially, they revert to a unicellular lifestyle. Cancers revert to a unicellular lifestyle, and as most people know, unicellular organisms evolve much faster than multicellular organisms because they have new generations much more quickly. Um, Geez, I'm totally forgetting what else I was going to say about cancer. Anyway, that's a real bummer, huh? Knowing more about cancer, kind of creepy. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about is the way this book discusses the history of medicine. So equally, like, I know too much about the publishing industry, and every title of every book is to some extent dishonest. Like, Bill Bryson wanted to write an anatomy and physiology book, a book about the function of the human body and about like medicine. Like he wanted to write like, the first bit of information. I mean, he wanted to write the information that goes in a biology textbook, but like in an interesting way. And if he had titled it like biology class, but interesting, no one would have read it. So instead, he titled it The Body and Occupants Guide, which is a bit dishonest because he's also talking about scientific advancements and as well as the history of medicine, just as much as he's talking about the body. But hey, I can't judge him for that. He's gotta sell his books somehow, and it's a very gentle lie to tell the public. Um, anyway, so the history of medicine is interesting. And the main thing that is interesting to me is just how uh, terrible medicine was until extremely recently. He describes some absolutely awful medical procedures, like early surgeries, especially. Like, ugh, people just going through absolute agony, um, with the hope that uh, they will get better, and sometimes a very small hope that they will get better. There are also plenty of medical problems that uh, like God, I just can't even imagine how our like Paleolithic ancestors would have experienced these types of problems. But medical issues that for us are just like routine and like not even on the radar of things that could harm you, let alone kill you. That for a pre-modern, like for like a medieval or like early Renaissance person, it's like congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to one of the most traumatic experiences in your life. And the people who lived even before that extent of medicine, I mean, I just don't even know. They must have just been dying from wacky bullshit all the time. Um, so one example is kidney stones, which we mostly think of as like kind of an inconvenience. If you've ever had them, you know that they're pretty terrible. But if you haven't, or just in popular culture, we just think of them as like, oh, this is just like a kind of uncomfortable, like unpleasant part of being older, especially being an older man. Um, but before we had modern medicine, before we had drugs you could take that would fix this problem. Kidney stones had the potential to straight up completely block your urinary tract. And hey, that's not going to work. Like you need your urinary tract. You will die if you don't have it. Um, and so we developed a surgery for removing kidney stones well before we developed antibiotics. So just I don't know, just think about that. Or actually, even better yet, just don't think about that. Um, Similarly, gut-wrenching stories for early cancer surgeries, stuff like that. Medicine used to just be horrible. And it actually makes sense. I read a lot of 19th century literature. It makes sense to me why, like, whenever medicine or doctors come up in those kinds of books, it's mainly to diss them because nobody liked going to the doctor because it meant you were probably going to experience unbearable agony. Um, and at the end of the day, that agony might not even help you very much. uh, and people clearly sort of could identify, or at least the like literati of the 19th century could clearly identify that in fact a lot of what was passing itself as medicine was superstition that was just being superstition that just happened to be believed by people who were supposed to know better, which I find really interesting. The other topic that he talks about is how bad modern medicine can be. And of course, modern medicine, medicine has come a long way since we were cutting people's bladders open without antibiotics or pain medications. But there are still some pretty severe problems, and in particular, he talks about the United States. And unfortunately, Bill Bryson doesn't really go all the way with this critique, but he mainly talks about the American healthcare system and how it's just so clear that for-profit medicine is bad for medicine and it's also inhumane to people. Like it costs so much money. Americans spend more per capita on their healthcare system than anyone else in the world. Um, and they don't even really benefit from it that much. Like their life expectancy is lower than that of most nations in the developed world. And yeah, I mean, he outlines a couple of ways that this happens, a couple of ways that we go from profit like incentive to bad medicine. Um, of course, I wish he spent more time on it, but it is nice to see someone who takes this like apolitical scientific veneer talk about some of the very obvious problems in medicine, in for-profit medicine. The other thing he talks about that I don't necessarily think is associated with the profit motive is that um, medicine is sort of pervaded by this ideology of a denial of death. And, maybe in the long term that will be a good thing. Like, wouldn't it be so sick if doctors invented a way that we don't have to die? As implausible as I think that is, I guess it's probably good for society that some people are pursuing that goal. Uh, However, in the short term, in terms of like medical practices, a focus on extending life at the cost of all else is like very detrimental. Like it means that a lot of people, their last couple of months on this earth will be spent experiencing, agony for uh in order to go through often experimental, unproven procedures that they're shouldering the cost for and that are not necessarily going to be that helpful. In other words, for the last like 12 months of your life, for some reason, we're still using like the same mentality and the same paradigm of the sort of like early Renaissance where people experience a whole lot of pain. Like it's very similar to early Renaissance medicine. I don't mean to say that people abandon, the discoveries of the last 200 years when you get to be in your 80s. But the experience of end of life medicine is much more painful and it's much worse. It's like time traveling back to the 1800s, except that now doctors are able to use like you know modern techniques to harm you. And I'm not even saying I don't want people to get this idea that I think that like curative medicine is bad and we shouldn't be like doing chemotherapy. Like I think those things are great, of course. It's just that a lot of times when someone has a condition that is extremely likely to kill them. We're talking, like 98 plus percent. And when the prognosis is like, okay, if you give us hundreds of thousands of dollars and agree to go through horrible agony, you might get to live an extra 6 months. Um, at that point, I think it's just better to let people die with dignity. And the other point that Bill Bryson makes is that a surprisingly small amount of medical research goes towards making medical discoveries more comfortable and more palatable for people, making life more pleasant for people to live and making medicine more pleasant for people to experience. Um, Oftentimes the energy that is dedicated in those directions is like follows a for-profit ethos, like people developing dieting drugs and stuff like that, rather than figuring out ways that we can maybe make, for example, chemotherapy less unpleasant for the people who have to go through it. Um, so that's interesting, like that discussion about the limitations of medicine, because um, I mean, I feel like medicine almost has this like veneer where like if you criticize the medical establishment in any way, I feel like a lot of people have this sort of like knee-jerk reaction that like, oh, you're anti-medicine. Which yeah, a lot of people who do criticize the medical establishment are anti-medicine, but there are also like good scientific and humanistic reasons for doing so. Not because you're against medicine, but because you think medicine is awesome and it should get even better. Uh, yeah. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about. I also have unintelligent design on my list, but now that I'm thinking about it, like, you probably already know what unintelligent design is. You probably already know all of the examples that I'm going to mention. So, to reiterate, I would say that this book is a really nice read if you are already studying medicine and you want to sort of put some meat on those bones, as it were. Or if you already know enough about medicine that you have that enough about the human body that you already sort of have a framework for this knowledge and you can integrate it into what you already know. But other than that, I honestly can't recommend this book because I just don't see how a normal person who didn't like take higher level biology in high school or study it a little bit in college or something, I don't see how a normal person is going to synthesize this knowledge into something that is worth having. I feel like it's for someone who doesn't already have the framework, it's just a collection of fun facts. So I don't know. Unless you read it basically exactly the way that I read it, where you read it alongside a more sort of like substantive approach to biology, a more exhaustive approach to biology, then I honestly can't really recommend the book. Oh, and I wanted to say one last thing about the structure before I go, which is the way that Bill Bryson writes this book. First of all, I think it's dangerous to infer who a person is based on the way that they write, based on this sort of like parasocial relationship that you have with them when reading a book. But I think Bill Bryson is depressed based on the way that he writes this book because the structure follows a it follows like an organ by organ, like organ system by organ system pattern. Like he talks about organ systems more or less in the order that most make sense to him. It's a little bit random, but sometimes there's some clear causality. Like I think he starts with the skin, which makes sense. It's the outermost layer. It's the thing that you see when you see a person. But then later, when he's talking about medicine, he sort of switches to a chronological view of the human organism, which is way more grim in my opinion, because chronological means we're talking about birth and then going towards death. So the last like eighth of this book is just depressing to read because you've read about all the major organ systems and you're like, okay, interesting. There's still some of this book left. I wonder where we're going. And then he's like, cancer. Cancer is really bad. And you're like, whoa, cancer is even worse than I thought it was. And then he's like, disease. Disease is terrible. And you're like, oh man, disease is terrible. And then he's like, and even if you get past all of that, old age, we don't know anything, we don't know very much about what causes people to get old, how to prevent it. It's probably implausible that we'll ever prevent it anyway. And so then he gives all of these like grim facts about aging. Um, he does give there are a few things mixed in there that are kind of nice. Like apparently 70% of the people that are near death um, report experiencing very intense dreams about their own death that are like comforting. So that's really nice. It's nice to learn that the human psychology or the human body has sort of built-in mechanisms for easing the terror of death. But um, but overall, the chronological approach is really really grim because it's clear that what we're approaching is the chapter on death. And surely enough, he gives us the chapter on death. And as I'm reading or rather listening to this book, I'm thinking, okay, this is quite horrible to read about. I mean, it's interesting, but it's quite disturbing. Uh, uh, because I mean, death is just disturbing. And I kept expecting him to tie it together with some kind of conclusion where he says, like, okay, the book's over, bye bye, we learned so much about the human body. But he doesn't. He just talks about death, and the final the final words of the book are like, that's death, the end of you. And then the book is just fucking over. He just leaves you with that. Like, what an asshole. Honestly, I genuinely feel like he has sort of a responsibility to his readers to not just be like, and then you die. But that is exactly what he does. So I don't know. I quite enjoyed it, but I honestly can't recommend the book. That's Bill Bryson's The Body, a Guide for Occupants. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye bye.